But every so often, I can't help but think, like, when is the next shoe gonna drop? I think grief in general, but especially this like cumulative grief, has a really nasty way of almost like forcing us to live there. Like we're just nervous. We're a little inherently scared about what's gonna come next. And like I said, when the other shoe's gonna drop, because you're like, I've lost so much already. How could I not lose more? The key is not to live there though, right? We don't want to allow those feelings to overcome us and overwhelm us to where we are not living in our highest and most beautiful self. But it's very natural to find ourselves a little uneasy and sort of dreading the day that we might endure another loss, because we know what it's like to experience one, let alone many. This is the Life with Grief podcast, the podcast that talks about and normalizes the complexities of grief, life after loss, and all this entails, and so much more. I want you to think of this podcast as a safe space where I'm a friendly face and we're just journeying through this together to figure out how to live life with our grief in tow. I'm your host, Tara Accardo. I'm a grief and transformational life coach, and I'm here to serve you guidance, support, tangible coping tools, inspiration, and some laughs along the way to help you cultivate a more meaningful, intentional, and beautiful life. But grieving or not, we're getting into countless topics here on the podcast, from coping with loss to self-development and so much more. I'm so grateful you're here. Let's dive right in. Hi guys, welcome back to the Life with Grief podcast. I'm your host, Tara Accardo, and today we are talking about a really important type of grief that I see often, I've experienced myself, and I really just thought it warranted a conversation. So today we are talking about cumulative grief. So we're going to chat about what this type of grief is and why this type of grief is especially difficult to cope with. But we'll also get into why getting a handle on this type of grief is so important and why coping with it is so important for us both short and long term. And of course, we're going to talk about some ways to do this because I would never leave you hanging on those coping tools. So let's get right into this. What is cumulative grief anyway? This type of grief can occur when someone experiences multiple losses either all at once or maybe back to back, or something happens before they've even really had a chance to process an earlier loss. And this was so me. I can't even tell you. Losing two parents back to back, for those who maybe haven't listened to my sort of intro story or don't know much about me yet, I lost both of my parents within 6 months of each other. And then my adorable little fur baby less than a year later. And so there was my entire immediate family just gone. And really more specifically, losing two parents back to back. I already knew I hadn't processed my mom's death before my dad's death came. My mom died of esophageal cancer in December of 2019. My dad of prostate cancer in July of 2020. And I've shared this before on the podcast, so I won't get too into it here, but just after my mom died, my dad's health started declining even further than it already had. The cancer had spread, but moreover, I could tell he just really wasn't himself after she died, honestly. He, was still my dad. He was still supportive of me. He still loved me. He did what he could, but I could just feel it. He was more melancholy. He was, certainly still sad and grieving, of course, but there was just this like palpable aura about him that things were not the same, understandably so, but they just wouldn't be the same. And honestly, I didn't really know what to do other than be there for him as much as I could, and I was. But I also, honestly, guys, I went through a lot of guilt because I still was taking care of a geriatric dog. I still had my boyfriend, now husband, at the time, and then we went through a breakup. And by the way, I just want to interrupt myself by saying here, just because we might lose loved ones, I'm just going to use this as an example, kind of back to back or within a week of each other or within months of each other or even a year or two. That's still a very short period of time in my opinion. But there could be other losses that we might suffer in here too. And for me, the breakup of me and my now husband, we got back together, obviously, but that was a loss for me too. I mean, that was like a living loss, and I was truly mourning that, in addition to my mom and my dad's health declining and all the things that I felt like I lost around me. And so, this is cumulative grief. This is a perfect example of that. And I see this all the time. I have people in my membership. I have people that I one-on-one coach. I see it all the time on social media, and I get DMs and all the things of people that are like, I lost so-and-so at this time, and then shortly after I had this, and then, it knows no bounds, this cumulative grief and these losses that we might suffer sort of back to back. And for me, I found myself grieving, my mom and then my dad before he was even gone. I have a whole episode on anticipatory grief, by the way. That is episode 13. So check that out specifically for a discussion around that and coping tools for that anticipatory grief. That is a whole nother rabbit hole to go down. So I want to talk about that. That's a really important thing. But for me, I mourned my dad as his old self, if you will, as he was mourning the life that he had with his wife that I was mourning too, right? As my mom, I just mourned her in a different way. And then my dad's life here in the physical world came to an end, and I grieved that very profoundly and very deeply. And then on top of that, that's when I sort of felt like I could really begin grieving my mom. And it was just this crazy, crazy, crazy process. And as humans, we might be like, how am I supposed to navigate this? How does one carry this immense burden of so much loss, especially in a short period of time? And to have loss and grief like this accumulate, that's heavy. Like, that is so heavy. And for me personally, and I'm sure you can empathize with this, if you are in this cumulative grief club, you might not know what to do with it all. You might feel very lost and very alone and very overwhelmed. That is certainly how I felt. And even when my dad was still alive, but I knew where his fate ultimately lied, I knew he wasn't going to be with us much longer. I realize now that I personally was in a state of denial and sort of a numbness of what my reality actually was. Like, I remember having the thought when my dad was in the ICU at one point, thinking like, I'm going to lose another parent. I'm legitimately going to have another parent die. I don't know when. I know it's coming. And that's really when I felt this cumulative grief start to happen. So for me, my mom's death, that altered my very existence. Not that my dad's death didn't, but it was like from the morning that my dad died and beyond is the point where I think I really started to take on that cumulative grief. Like I said, it started coming even before he died, and as I went through that breakup and everything else. But that is really when I started to feel the fibers of my life shifting and the axis on which my life was positioned just really break, and really break for good. So, I ask you, can you relate to any of this? Please feel free to shoot me an email, DM me. I love to hear about everyone else's experiences with this too. Like, before we really get into this episode, please know you're not alone. I just wanted to share that little piece of my story in case you can empathize with any of it. So when you have experienced multiple losses within a short time period, like I alluded to earlier, you might begin to wonder how much more loss you can endure. And honestly, I have to say, it's really incredible what the human psyche and like what we can endure. That was a feeling that I was all too familiar with, was just this thought process of like, how much more can I endure here? And honestly, I still feel that way sometimes. I don't like live my life that way, but every so often I can't help but think like, when is the next shoe gonna drop? And I think grief in general, but especially this like cumulative grief, has a really nasty way of almost like forcing us to live there. Like we're just nervous. We're a little inherently scared about what's going to come next. And like I said, when the other shoe is going to drop, because you're like, I've lost so much already. How could I not lose more? And so I just want to validate if you're feeling that way. That's a very natural way to feel. The key is not to live there, though, right? We don't want to allow those feelings to overcome us and overwhelm us to where we are not living in our highest and most beautiful self. But it's very natural to find ourselves a little uneasy and sort of dreading the day that we might endure another loss, because we know what it's like to experience one, let alone many. For me, I worry that I might not be able to take my own advice as a grief coach and as a transformational life coach that I give grievers just like you, but it's that feeling of like being back to square one, so to speak. That's very scary. Like we can make so much progress with our grief and how we're handling it and our healing journey of sorts, but the idea of being taken back to those early days of grief when things just hurt, and they hurt so bad. And not that they don't always hurt a little bit, right? But all of that is very scary, and it's very difficult, and it's a burden. Hey, my friend, are you needing some relief from your grief? If so, I have an exciting new offering that will help you get exactly that. My 14-day Relief in Your Grief challenge brings you powerful, impactful, bite-sized daily content alongside the perfect meditation. One of the biggest struggles I hear from my members, clients, and people on social media is that they just need some relief from the stress, sadness, and pain that grief and loss can cause. But here's the thing. So many people are lost and unsure about where to start. This can feel like a huge thing to tackle, so we are doing it together, and we're starting with just 14 days. Give me 2 weeks and I will help you begin to take that anxiety, heartache, and anguish and turn it into peace, clarity, and hope as you move forward with your grief. Seriously, what do you have to lose by joining? Challenge your grief and give yourself some relief, my friend. I have no doubt this 14 days will be an inspiring, uplifting, perspective-changing experience for you. Join now through the link in the show description. And, for me, like I mentioned, I had lost my dog as well. And it was really hard losing her because not only was, of course, I grieving her, but like she was the main thing that kept me happy and kept my hopes up after I lost my parents. Like she was my girl. So anyone who's lost furry friends here, they are so a part of this grieving process and this cumulative grief that we might feel too, because not only did I have her since I was 10 years old, I had she was 19 years old, but like to not have her too after all of this, like that was so crippling. It was like, I felt like just the last, it was just like the last straw that broke the camel's back on my grief. So let's shift into unpacking each form of grief separately a little bit, or unpacking each loss separately and really holding space for all of that. I've said it before, unpacking multiple losses, that can be extremely painful, very overwhelming, and it can be very difficult to function at all, let alone function well on a daily basis because of the gravity and the weight of it all. And I just want to share this. I once heard this awesome quote, and it's especially relevant if cumulative grief is something that you are or have struggled with. And that quote says, "You have a unique relationship with each person who died. Therefore, you can't be expected to lump all your feelings of grief into one box and expect to quickly unpack it all at once. Each individual loss needs to be processed separately. When you experience multiple losses, the feelings are intense and overwhelming. So again, basically just summarizes what I just said. And I want to get into, this is where we'll talk about some coping tools and just some mindset shifts and things to keep in mind as we are navigating cumulative grief, especially. But let's just talk about some symptoms of this really quick. So some symptoms of cumulative grief can be very intense and long lasting. And this makes sense, right? Especially if things are accumulating. It feels like it just prolongs the process. It prolongs the grieving. And this is where we can really start to feel very underwater with it all. You, of course, might feel very sad, maybe even a little depressed. You might be really irritable and angry, often more frequently. Again, I think this is just because of everything that is going on. It is quite literally piling up. You might have trouble sleeping, or you might just feel like you just want to sleep all day. You might feel very lethargic. And it can also feel really hard to enjoy things that you used to love. Also, making decisions might feel nearly impossible. I definitely can speak to this, especially once my dad died. And then, like I said, I was kind of starting to really grieve both my mom and my dad at this point, like individually, but then also together as our family unit. I could not even tell you what I wanted for dinner. I mean, like if people would ask me things or like, what I wanted to eat or if I wanted to go and do something or whatever, I was like, I need yes or no questions, please. Like I can't be asked to formulate like a coherent response. So if you're experiencing any of the things that I just said, or also physical symptoms like headaches or stomach aches or chronic pain, this could be an indication that you might be experiencing some cumulative grief, or the grief that you do have is accumulating. And this is why addressing this type of grief is so important, because if it is left unaddressed and not taken care of, it can lead to a range of negative emotions such as sadness, anxiety, anger, hopelessness. And of course, this is a natural part of grief, right? So I want to just acknowledge that. What I mean more here is if these feelings are really profound, or you are going into more of the depression territory, or there are other mental health issues coming up, this is when I want to just encourage you, please, please, please seek out professional help to work through this. I never say any of these things to scare anyone. It is more like it's just so good to be on top of it and prevent it before it gets too bad, right? And too overwhelming. And in addition to affecting our emotional well-being, cumulative grief can also impact our physical health. So it can lead to increased stress levels, which can ultimately weaken our immune system and make us more susceptible to illness or other discomfort or dis-ease. So for example, I personally tend to harbor a lot of physical pain in my neck and in my shoulders. This was especially bad in my earlier stages of grief. And so we just have to be so careful with all of this. Our heart, our mind, our body, it all needs rest and care and attention. So this is just my cautionary tale. I would be remiss if I didn't say this. Please do not allow this kind of grief to get the best of you. It is far too important to ignore. And like I said, we're going to get to some coping tools as just a place to start, but it really requires a lot of awareness and self-awareness to just make sure that it doesn't get too bad for you. And I also just want to point out here, age can really increase your risk for cumulative grief, especially as people reach their 70s, their 80s, even their 90s. They might begin to experience the deaths of friends and family members at higher rates than those, who are in the earlier parts of our lives. So, cumulative grief, it doesn't discriminate. We can experience this at basically any age, at any stage of life, but we have to remember at the same time, these individuals in this age range might be experiencing secondary losses of independence, mobility, maybe even housing, right? If they've been comfortable in their particular home for years and they might be moving into assisted living or something like that, these losses can really compound on one another, which can cause a great deal of anguish and even further grief. So again, all things to just be aware of here. So while losses in cumulative grief often happen, like I said, back to back, it's important to note that sometimes it can just occur over the course of a little bit longer of a time. So what do I mean by that? Obviously, I just talked about, maybe it's not so back to back as in like weeks and months of each other, but another aspect to this is when someone has avoided processing an earlier loss, whether that's just because life circumstances have just prevented that mourning or whatever it is that might prevent us from acknowledging and properly mourning a previous loss, a new loss can cause all of the feelings of grief to reach a boiling point. I see this so often where we just haven't properly dealt with something, I'm going to say like older. And so this new grief or a new loss can kick up a lot of feelings of unresolved grief or unresolved emotions that haven't been acknowledged and dealt with. So that can then lead to cumulative grief or forgotten grief from a loss many years earlier. That can come back to the surface because of a new loss. So I want to acknowledge that too. I just want to acknowledge all sides of cumulative grief here and like what it could actually show up as and what it could look like. Probably goes without saying, but this experience can be very disturbing and very painful and kind of shocking even, because you're like, wait, where did this come from? Oh my God, I kind of thought I had dealt with that. Maybe I didn't deal with it as well as I thought I did, or, it can resurface in so many ways. So that all being said, let's get into some coping tools. All right, let's talk about how we can just begin to scratch the surface of coping with cumulative grief. And like the rest of the types of grief, I just want to acknowledge, again, especially having gone through this particular type of grief myself, that sometimes it's hard to even recognize this in the moment. This is so important. And honestly, you might be listening to different episodes on this podcast, or maybe you've stumbled on this one, not even realizing that you have cumulative grief, or maybe it was like the anticipatory grief that I spoke about earlier. You might not even be realizing that you're going through that. I didn't at the time, because not only did I not know what anticipatory grief was or cumulative grief, but I just hadn't really experienced like a very profound, painful loss before. Like I had lost some family members. It was when I was younger. Not that I didn't miss them, not that I didn't grieve them, but it was just different, right? We've talked about this on other episodes of the podcast. Like, it's not like they weren't worthy of our grieving, but there are just some losses that we go through in life that just really, like I said earlier, just totally throw our entire world off its axis. So please, if you have taken the time to listen to this episode so far, or any other episode on the podcast where you might be like, oh, this is actually sounding familiar, or this is something I have or am experiencing. Again, it's just great to be aware of, and just be sure to take moments out of your day to be present and to tap into this, because you never know. Like, could your losses be building up on you a little bit? It's just something to think about. On the other hand, if you've already acknowledged this, or you are very aware that this is happening, either way, let's talk about some coping tools here really quickly. And again, this is a more high-level episode here today. I want to preface all of this by saying I have my blog on my website with countless great resources and blog posts that go into detail on some of these things and ways to cope. I get more into this in my membership. I give my members really specific ways to cope and prompts and exercises and more kind of action-based tools on a monthly basis to really dig into this and, cope with it very intentionally. Real quick interruption here, and then we'll get back to this episode. If you're someone who is experiencing some form of loss and are trying to navigate the complexities of grief, which you likely are in some capacity if you've stumbled upon this podcast, then this message is for you. If you haven't heard about my Life with Grief membership and community yet, this is truly something you need to check out. This membership is here to guide you into living a deeper, more meaningful, and full life after experiencing loss. Who doesn't want that, right? I created this membership because I know what it's like to navigate and cope with grief on a daily basis, and I know the tools and support it takes to do this effectively. I've done the work myself, and I've coached people just like you to do the same. It comes down to having impactful, effective resources and tools at your disposal, having the right support around you from people who can understand and empathize with your grief, and having encouragement and inspiration around you consistently to not only elicit and spark change, but to keep it and keep the positive momentum going. Enrollment opens once a month for a limited time. Check out the details linked in the description, and I hope to see you in there. And I also, like I said, I one-on-one coach as well. So if you really need that more personalized help, I'm also here for you in that way as well. I do both grief coaching and transformational life coaching. So I got you wherever you're at in this process. Okay, so number one, as far as coping with this particular type of loss, taking care of your mental health. I have alluded to this already. I can't stress enough how important it is to prioritize self-care when you are coping with this type of grief. I know self-care is a buzzword. Hear me out on this. One thing here is getting enough quality sleep. I have talked about this here on the podcast before. There is a blog post that I have on this. And by the way, a lot of this will be linked in the show notes, so you don't have to go digging for anything. But that quality sleep, it's really important. It's important for keeping you clear-headed and just very aware of what is going on for you right now, what is coming up. And it just allows you just a little more clarity to be able to kind of, I'm going to say, come out of your grief just a little bit and have more, what I mean by that is having more of a macro view on it and how you're really feeling and how you're really coping on a day-to-day basis. So sleep is very important for that. Also, having a healthy diet, right? Like making sure you're eating healthy, making sure you're getting enough water, all the things. It just enables us to be a little bit sharper. And I want to acknowledge here that so many of us also have a job that we have to continue working. Maybe we don't have the luxury of taking time off, or we get our typical, 5 to 7 business days of bereavement leave, or maybe that's all we have, yet we have to still continue functioning, or we have a family or a kid, kids or a partner or something to keep us busy. And we don't have the luxury of just being able to sit with our grief as often as we'd like. So all the more reason to just maintain as much balance in our life as possible. You guys, I know that's hard. Like I said, I have other tools and resources on how to help you with this specifically, but I always want to mention that because I think people really throw diet and exercise and getting enough water out the window when you're grieving. It's just not the highest priority. I get it. I have been there, but exercising regularly, and it's not to lose weight, right? It's getting fresh air. It's getting your mind going. It's getting your body and your muscles and all the good things moving. And that really helps us to kind of like release a lot of this pent up emotion and grief that we have within us that we might be holding, right? Talked about the neck and shoulders. So stretching, yoga, Pilates, running, weight training, bike riding, I don't know, whatever it is that resonates with you, to be able to breathe and release a lot of this, that is so, so important. And also just engaging in activities that bring you joy and maybe provide you a sense of purpose. I always say, your grief and like your loss specifically, there doesn't have to be a purpose behind it. There doesn't have to be such a specific, like, I have to find meaning in this. It's not finding meaning so much in the death. It's understanding how it has impacted you, how it has impacted your life, and maybe even the trajectory of your life when you did not ask for the trajectory of your life to change. I acknowledge that. I want to validate how difficult that is, because so often we don't ask for the losses that we go through, right? It's the nature of life. The thing that we want to do is just acknowledge that it happened, hold space for it, and quite literally take it a day at a time after that. That's all it is. Another sort of coping tool here that I have is practicing that mindfulness. And that mindfulness can help you stay present in the moment, which is really great for coping with very overwhelming emotions or situations. So again, consider practicing meditation, yoga, deep breathing exercises. All of these can really help you stay grounded. Couple things here that I'll just call out specifically. Box breath. I love this. This is great. I'm sure if anyone here deals with anxiety, maybe something as severe as panic attacks, box breath is amazing for this. So if you were not aware of what box breath is, as an example, you can breathe in for 4 counts, hold it for 4 counts, and let it out for 4 counts. This is pretty much always how I start my one-on-one coaching sessions. This is something I really just cannot express the importance of enough, is just breathing however you can. And in addition to this, really getting in touch with your 5 senses. So what does that mean? As you are trying to ground yourself, as you are trying to get present and just process all of the grief swirling around you, the best way that I recommend my clients and people I work with that need a little bit of grounding and attention to what is going on in the moment is checking in with your 5 senses, literally. So what do you smell? What do you see? What are you touching right now? Is it a desk? Is it, the chair that you're sitting in? Is it the pavement that you're walking on? Is it, the car you're driving, and feeling the steering wheel? I mean, really getting kind of like granular with it. What do you hear? What do you taste? Are you tasting anything in particular? And even outside of our grief, this is just a really amazing way to just be more present with your surroundings and to slow down. A lot of the people that I actually coach really more on the life coaching side. It's the transformational life coaching. And many of them, they're like, I really want to slow down, Tara. Like, I've been through a lot. I feel like I've been really hyped up for a long time. I feel like I've been just on the defensive, and I just want to relax. I want to find peace, and I want to find just slowness and grounding. And so this is one of the main things that I recommend. And, we work in detail on this together on how to incorporate that practice of getting in touch with our 5 senses into our daily life. So I just wanted to throw that out there as well. I also have a freebie for practicing presence as well. So you can get that on my website. And that is also something I will link here in the show notes as well. But really the best advice I have as far as mindfulness and practicing that presence is just witnessing your grief and holding space for it. I have definitely talked about that on the podcast here before, so I will not belabor this, but really just having literally a dedicated time each day to hold that space for yourself and for your grief. So if it's 5 or 10 minutes, and I'm kind of spoiling my next point here, but journaling a little bit, again, just meditating on your grief and you and your life as a whole as it stands right now, trying to make sense of it, right? Because with grief, and especially with cumulative grief, it can be very hard to make sense of and comprehend everything that's going on, everything that's happening, because there's a lot, right? And so it is really important now more than ever that you allow that time to slow down, to breathe, to take a beat, to get away from the kids for a moment, to get away from your partner for a moment if you have to get away from your job for a moment if you have to. Be gentle with yourself. Give yourself that gift of that alone time. Another thing I really want to encourage as just an overarching coping tool is expressing your feelings. I can't say it enough. It is so important to express your emotions and at least cope with them, even if you don't express them out loud to anybody when dealing with cumulative grief. So again, whether you are speaking with a professional, i.e. myself, or a therapist or a counselor, You can also journal, as I just mentioned, either through free writing or, also using my Losses Become Gains daily journal, which you can learn more about on my website. It's linked here in the show notes. That's available on Amazon. That is a prompted journal, but there's also room for free writing. I really wanted to make sure there were both in there, so you can use it however you feel is best. But that's a really great way that if you're maybe not comfortable speaking about it, or you really just need to get some of these ruminating thoughts you might be having out of your brain for 5 minutes, journaling is an amazing way to do that. And it doesn't have to take you forever, right? My journal, it takes 5 minutes to do every day. There's a morning practice, there's an evening practice. It's beautiful. It's one of my most favorite things I've ever created. So go check it out if you think you might benefit from that. Also, talking to a friend maybe that you feel comfortable with. And I just want to say here, through Losses Become Gains and through the community that I've built through that and through this podcast, I have stumbled across some of the most beautiful souls and have made such wonderful friends through this community. Not that I didn't have that in my existing support system, but I've truly found people through this medium that just get me on a level that some other people in my life just don't. And it's not their fault, right? They just maybe haven't been through what I have, or just can't quite understand my grief in a way that other people can. Or, all of our grief is unique. I've said this many, many times. So just because there are other people out there that have lost both parents, they're not going to quite understand my losses the way that I do. But it's a start, and finding people that are just kind of on your wavelength, or maybe have some dark humor like you do, which, hi, that's so me. You just need that sometimes. But it's just a matter of finding your people. So again, remember, they don't necessarily need to completely understand your situation or your loss. It's highly unlikely anyone will truly, quote, get it, so to speak. But just finding a friend or a small group of friends who have been through something similar, it's such a game changer. And it really allows you to just vent or have that outlet and that additional support that you might not even realize that you need. And I promise you, it's out there. Your people are out there. Or maybe it's simply just someone who's a great listener. And so I just really encourage you to seek out a community of like-minded people. Like I said, exploring the services of a professional if a group setting isn't quite your thing. But this is also just a great opportunity too, that outside of speaking with actual humans and actual people, expressing your feelings through art or reading or music, I just encourage you, get creative, dare I say, have some fun with it, maybe even challenge yourself, because the thing with grief and the thing with loss is that you just never know what it's going to open up for you. I recently posted something about this actually, but I never would have created the Life with Grief podcast had I not endured some form of grief. So I wouldn't be able to speak to this, and I wouldn't be able to use my voice in this way and be able to speak with people such as yourself who have been through something similar. So this was just a way that I felt the need to express myself. And the thing is, you don't have to create anything big and grandiose with your loss or what you've been through. But it is an opportunity to try and wrap our head around, okay, what have I been through? How does this affect me now? And what does this mean for me moving forward? And that doesn't have to be an overwhelming process. I know it can feel that way, but it's really just throwing that out there and seeing what comes to you, and just having an open heart and an open mind to that, because you just never know. If I hadn't opened myself up in this way, for example, creating Losses Become Gains, creating this podcast, I never would have met the people that have also been through something difficult that I just mentioned. And I can safely say some of these friends that I've met are going to be friends for life. They have changed my perspective, and that's a beautiful thing. And that is not to negate my loss. That is not to mitigate the grief that I do have. It's to support it. It's building support around what we so desperately need support with. So again, I'm here for you. My inbox is open. My DMs are open. If you need additional support or you just need a little direction, I'm here for you, my friend. So just some final thoughts on cumulative loss and cumulative grief. You are probably going to curse my name for saying what I'm about to say to you, but I'm going to say it anyway because that's what I do here. Healing from cumulative grief, grief of any kind, it takes time. It just does. I'm not here to say time heals all wounds. That's really not a thing, in my opinion. And it's not just this time alone. Why I'm saying to you that it takes time is because the brain is playing a game of catch up with your reality. And especially for those of us who have had multiple losses or things are just coming up because we haven't resolved it right the first time, that takes time. That takes energy and effort for the brain to rewire and make sense of it all. That is an exhausting process. That can be an overwhelming process. And when we lose a loved one, especially, or again, really any loss, I talked about my relationship and my breakup earlier too. That's another perfect example. Either way, it's a shock to our system, as you likely already know. And it takes our brain time, sometimes a lot of time, to update its prediction software, so to speak, and to understand what this new reality of yours now looks and feels like. And so when we journey through a loss, especially in those early days, it is constantly having to learn and relearn based on our new lived experiences. So, for example, it's you being used to that loved one calling you or texting you or whatever it looks like. Maybe they walk in the door at 5:30 when they get home from work, but now all of a sudden that's just stopped. And as far as our brain is considered, it has stopped rather immediately. That's confusing. That takes time. So we have to allow it the time it needs to get accustomed to what is happening right now, right in front of you, day by day. So I'm just going to mention that, that mindfulness, that being present, that getting grounded. With this kind of grief especially, it is super important because, again, we're trying to wrap our head around that reality. And that is a process, but the more that we can be like, okay, let me take a breath. This is what's happening right here, right now. This is what I have to focus on. This is what I have to be grateful for. This is what I just want to acknowledge is going on in my life right now. Here are the people that are around me. Here are the people that are showing up. Let me give my time and attention and energy to that. And the rest very slowly falls into place. So be patient with yourself. Don't rush this process. Allow yourself to feel those emotions without judgment. This accumulation of your grief will slowly ease up. I promise you, but it does take a little bit of work. That pile of bricks that you're feeling on your heart right now, it's going to lessen. It's going to be taken apart piece by piece, and a more peaceful, more fulfilled existence will be soon upon you day by day. With time, with energy, and with the right coping tools, it does have the potential to ease up. And please remember that I am here for you every step of the way. If you found this episode helpful or impactful for you in some way, I would so appreciate a rating or review wherever you're listening, or better yet, sharing this podcast or this episode with someone who could use it. My mission is to reach as many grievers, to provide as much help and guidance and support as I can. As always, I'm so grateful you are here and hanging out with me. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next episode. I am sending you a huge thank you for tuning into today's episode, my friend. I'm so grateful you're here and for the steps you are taking to heal your heart, open your mind, fulfill your soul, learn, grow, and evolve, and move through this crazy thing called life in big, beautiful, impactful ways. Visit lossesbecomegains.com for my blog, ways to work with me, to shop my daily journal, and so much more. And be sure you're following along on Instagram and Facebook at Life with Grief Podcast.
I love seeing new faces, meeting new people, hearing your stories, and supporting you however I can. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. If you haven't left a rating or a review, please do so. I would so appreciate it. Or if you feel so inclined, to share this episode or this podcast with someone who could use it too. I'll catch you in the next episode.